It was after midnight when the power went out. The wind howled like it had a score to settle with the world, and the rain pounded against the windows in waves. I had just gotten into bed finally alone, after a long, bitter dinner with my husband Mark, barely said 2 words to me. The silence between us had become more suffocating than any storm. I was pulling the covers up to my chest when I heard the creak. At first, I thought it was just the wind. This old house had always groaned in the rain. But then came another sound, softer but unmistakable. The door. It clicked open. He stood there in the dark, outlined only by the flashes of lightning behind him. "Jake?" I asked, confused. He was wearing a t-shirt barefoot, his hair slightly damp from the hallway humidity. He didn't say anything, just walked in, slowly, calmly. He didn't knock, he didn't ask, and he didn't leave. I sat up straighter. "Is everything okay?" His eyes met mine, steady and unreadable. I just didn't want to be alone. That's when I realized neither did I. Jake had been my stepson for 5 years. He came to live with us after his mom passed away. At first, we were strangers bound by law and awkward dinners. But lately, we had grown. Not closer, but not as distant either. There was a quiet understanding between us. One that Mark never seemed interested in noticing. The thunder cracked again, and for a moment the whole room lit up. That's when I saw it. His hands were shaking. I patted the edge of the bed. Just for a minute, I whispered, unsure who I was really talking to, him or myself. He walked over, sat down, slowly leaned back against the headboard beside me. We didn't touch. We didn't speak. But something shifted, and I knew. Whatever this was, it had just begun. Jake had been in my life since he was 17. I met him the same month I married his father, Mark, a man who was strong on the outside, but always seemed emotionally locked from within. Back then, Jake was quiet, withdrawn, grieving the loss of his mother in his own way. I didn't expect him to warm up to me quickly, and he didn't. But over time, our coexistence softened. It started with small things, him rinsing the dishes after I cooked, offering to take out the trash without being asked, asking if I wanted a tea when he brewed one for himself. Mark, on the other hand, was rarely present. My husband's career came before everything, before Jake, before me, before any sense of emotional intimacy. The house was filled with his absence. His chair sat cold at the dinner table more nights than not. And when he was home, he either criticized or ignored. Nothing in between. Jake noticed. He noticed when I stayed too long in the kitchen just to avoid another night in silence. He noticed when I wore makeup, even though I claimed I was just running errands. He noticed when I cried in the laundry room, though he never said a word about it. And I noticed him too. Not in a way I should have, not at first. But as the years passed and he grew into a man taller than his father, gentler in tone, more present in the home, I found myself looking for his presence, craving the conversations that didn't feel like walking on glass. The night he walked into my room, it wasn't the beginning. It was the boiling point of years of emotional erosion. Mark and I hadn't shared a bed in months. We hadn't shared more than 3 minutes of meaningful conversation in nearly a year. Jake, on the other hand, had become the only person in the house who asked me how I was and listened. That stormy night wasn't just about loneliness. It was about finally being seen. And as we sat in silence under the glow of flickering candlelight, his shoulder brushed mine ever so lightly. It was nothing. But it wasn't. My heart raced. I swallowed hard. I should have moved. I didn't. The wind shrieked through the cracks in the old window pane, and the candle on my nightstand flickered nervously, as if it too sensed something wasn't right. Jake's shoulder was still touching mine. We weren't speaking. There was nothing to say. Nothing we could say that wouldn't have been dangerous. But silence has a way of becoming louder than words, especially when it's filled with everything you're afraid to admit. I glanced at him. He was staring straight ahead, lips slightly parted, breathing slow but deep. His fingers were laced together in his lap like he was holding something back. I don't know what possessed me to reach for his hand. Maybe it was the thunder. Maybe it was the way I hadn't felt warm skin in months. Or maybe it was the fact that I was tired of pretending. I placed my hand gently on top of his. He didn't flinch. He turned slowly to look at me, and when our eyes met, I knew the moment had arrived. The one you imagine in fantasy, but hope never actually happens. Because once it does, there's no turning back. He leaned in, just a little, a breath's distance from my cheek. "You don't have to be alone tonight," he whispered. It was wrong. I knew it. Every fiber of my being screamed that it was wrong. I had helped raise this boy. I was his father's wife. This house was built on rules, on names, titles, expectations. But none of that mattered in that moment. What mattered was that someone had seen me, touched me like I mattered, looked at me like I wasn't invisible. His lips brushed mine, soft, hesitant, terrified. I should have stopped him. I should have pulled away. But I didn't. We kissed. Not long, not like in the movies. It was awkward, brief trembling, and yet electric. I could hear my heart pounding louder than the rain. I broke the kiss and turned my face away, ashamed of myself, but still not letting go of his hand. "We shouldn't," I breathed. "I know," he said, "but we already did." And that was it. We sat in the candlelight quiet, stunned by what we had allowed to happen. The storm kept howling outside, but the real storm had started between us. And I knew this was no longer a line we had approached. It was a line we had crossed. I didn't sleep. I lay there wide-eyed, long after Jake had quietly slipped out of my room. I could still feel the warmth of his hand in mine, the shape of his lips on mine, and the weight of what had just happened pressing against my chest like a stone. The storm had passed, but inside me something even more dangerous had begun to form. When I finally did close my eyes, it was almost morning. I only drifted off for an hour or so before the light crept in through the blinds, and the familiar creaks of the old house returned, groaning in the silence that used to feel normal now thick with secrets. I got out of bed and stared at myself in the mirror. Same face, same tired eyes. But I didn't recognize her. I wasn't a woman who kissed her stepson. I wasn't someone who betrayed her husband. I wasn't who I thought I was. Downstairs, the house smelled of burnt toast. I followed the scent and found Jake in the kitchen, standing over the toaster with his back to me. He didn't turn around. "Good morning," I said softly. He looked up at the ceiling, then finally turned to face me. His expression wasn't regretful. It wasn't proud either. It was complicated. "Hey," he said like nothing had happened. "Want some coffee?" I hesitated. "Sure." He poured 2 mugs and handed me one. Our fingers brushed. I felt it again, the current, the electricity, and also the dread. We sat at the table. The same table where I had spent countless dinners trying to make conversation between a distracted husband and a silent stepson. Now everything had changed, and yet it hadn't. Neither of us spoke about last night. We didn't need to. It hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire we had tried to pretend didn't happen. But it had. Later that day, Mark called from out of town. His voice was as flat as ever. "Just checking in," he said. "Everything good there?" I looked at Jake across the room who was watching me closely. Yes, I lied. Everything's fine. But everything wasn't fine. That kiss, however fleeting, had cracked something open inside me. A part of me that had been sleeping for years. A part of me that felt wanted, seen, alive. And that terrified me. Because if I could justify one kiss, what else could I justify? We avoided each other for 3 days. Not in a dramatic way. There were no slammed doors, no panicked whispers. We just retreated into silence. He kept to his room. I kept to mine. We passed each other in the hallway like we were strangers again. It was almost comforting, like we had quietly agreed that if we didn't speak of it, maybe it hadn't happened. But it had. Every time our eyes met, even accidentally, I could feel the weight of that night pressing down between us, like the tension before thunder. On the 4th evening, Mark returned home. He brought with him the usual baggage work emails, barely there smiles, and the stench of a hotel room on his clothes. He kissed my cheek like it was a formality and patted Jake on the shoulder like he was an afterthought. I watched them from across the room, and for a moment, I felt like I was outside of my own life, observing 2 men who had no idea that their dynamic had shifted permanently. That night, I lay in bed beside my husband for the first time in weeks. He didn't touch me, didn't even look at me. He fell asleep in 5 minutes, snoring softly, like the house hadn't been set on fire in his absence. I stared at the ceiling wide awake, wondering how 2 people could share a bed and yet be so far apart. At 2:13 a.m., I got up to get a glass of water. As I passed Jake's door, it opened. We stood there in the dim hallway light, neither of us speaking. He looked exhausted. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. I shook my head. "No." He nodded, then stepped aside. "You can come in, if you want." I didn't answer, but I walked in. We didn't touch. We didn't kiss. We didn't do anything that could be named or categorized. We just lay there side by side, listening to each other breathe in the darkness. Our arms didn't touch, but our thoughts were tangled. At some point, I whispered, "It can't happen again." Jake turned his head toward me. "I know. We promised ourselves it had been a mistake, a one-time lapse, a crack in the surface." But as his hand reached for mine under the blanket, I realized something deeply unsettling. Mistakes don't repeat themselves, but patterns do. And this was becoming a pattern. The weeks that followed were a delicate balancing act, one I was never trained to perform. I played the role of the dutiful wife, setting dinner on the table, asking Mark about his day, even though I knew he wasn't listening. I folded laundry, answered emails, smiled when neighbors passed by. But behind every smile, there was something unraveling. Jake and I barely spoke in public. We kept our exchanges brief, polite, even slightly cold, just enough to keep Mark from noticing. But when we were alone, when the house quieted, when the hours stretched too long and the nights felt too hollow, it started again. It wasn't always physical. Sometimes it was just a glance from across the room that lingered too long. Sometimes it was the way he'd brush past me in the hallway close enough for his arm to graze mine. Sometimes it was just the silence we sat in together, while the world outside went on as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and it kept happening. One evening, Mark had gone out with his colleagues, said he wouldn't be home until late. I told myself I'd go to bed early. I told myself Jake would stay in his room. I told myself we'd be fine. I lied. He knocked softly on my bedroom door. Just once. I didn't answer with words. I opened it. He stepped inside, and for the first time since that stormy night, he kissed me like he meant it. Not hesitant, not unsure. I let him. After we sat on the floor beside the bed, our legs tangled backs against the wall. He rested his head on my shoulder like it was the most natural thing in the world. But it wasn't. I kept thinking about Mark, where he was, what he would say, what he would do if he ever found out. Jake must have felt it because he whispered, "Do you regret it?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I asked, "Do you..." He looked at me, really looked at me and said, "No, I regret everything that came before it." And that's when I knew we had crossed into something even more dangerous than forbidden desire. We had crossed into emotional territory. Not just lust, not just loneliness, but longing. And longing doesn't stay quiet forever. The more it happened, the easier it became to justify. That's what scared me the most. In the beginning, there was guilt. Every touch felt like a betrayal, every whisper like a ticking bomb. But over time, the shame blurred. The boundaries bent. And what once felt unthinkable began to feel inevitable. Jake and I had carved out our own world, one that lived in the pauses between conversation, in the moments after Mark left the room, in the seconds before we passed each other on the stairs. We were hiding in plain sight. But hiding gets messy, and lies leave a trail even when you think you've buried them. One morning, I found a shirt in the laundry. Jake's unmistakably his folded neatly into Mark's drawer. I froze. Mark never touched the laundry. Ever. Had Jake been careless? Had Mark noticed? Had I? Later that night, Mark asked, "Has Jake seemed different to you lately?" My heart thudded. Different how? He shrugged. I don't know. Quieter. Distant. I tried to ask him something last week, and he just nodded and walked off. Like he wasn't even there. I laughed. It sounded forced. "He's 23, Mark. That's how they are." Mark nodded, but his eyes stayed on me. Too long, too still. I changed the subject. Fast. But my mind spiraled. We were becoming reckless. Worse, we were becoming obvious. Jake and I agreed to take space. That's what we called it. No more late-night visits. No more soft glances. We even started texting less, only when necessary. And I told myself we were doing the right thing. But longing doesn't just disappear. It finds cracks to crawl through. I caught myself smelling the sweatshirt Jake had left in the laundry room. I lingered in the kitchen just to hear his footsteps upstairs. I'd press play on a movie I didn't care about, hoping he'd come down to watch it with me. One night he did. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, both pretending to focus on the screen. Neither of us touched our phones. Neither of us spoke. But when the movie ended, neither of us moved. "Do you still think about it?" I asked without turning toward him. He didn't answer right away. "Every night," he said. And that's when I realized distance wasn't solving anything. It was only making the silence between us louder. And it was only a matter of time before someone would hear it. It happened on a Thursday. Mark came home earlier than expected. The plan was simple. He'd be at a company dinner until midnight. Jake would be at the gym, and I'd have the house to myself. I needed that space not for Jake, not for anything inappropriate, but just to breathe, just to be alone without pretending. I was curled up on the living room couch in my robe glass of wine, in hand, flipping through an old photo album. I hadn't meant to open it. It had just appeared while I was looking for a charger in the hallway drawer. There he was, Jake at 18, standing stiffly next to me in a family Christmas photo. I looked at it for too long, trying to remember what I felt then. Guilt hadn't existed yet. There was just discomfort. Distance. Now the distance was gone, and I wasn't sure which version of us I missed more. The front door opened. I jumped, snapping the album shut and nearly spilling my wine. Mark walked in keys, jangling, face drawn. Dinner ended early. They canceled dessert. Budget cuts. He chuckled at his own joke. I forced a smile. I was still clutching the photo album like it was evidence in a trial. He noticed. "What's that?" "Oh, just cleaning out drawers," I said, placing it gently beside me. "Found this old thing." He walked over and sat beside me. His body close, but still unfamiliar. He flipped it open. "God, remember this trip?" he asked, pointing to a blurry beach photo. "Jake got food poisoning the next day. Ruined the whole weekend." I nodded, pretending to laugh. Jake entered the house moments later, damp from the rain gym bag slung over his shoulder. He saw the scene and froze. Mark looked up. "Hey, bud, you remember this photo?" Jake walked slowly toward us. His eyes found mine for a fraction of a second. Then he turned his gaze to the page. "Yeah, I remember." His voice was calm, too calm. Mark chuckled. "You look so stiff, like you didn't want to be there." Jake shrugged. I didn't. I watched Jake, how he stood behind the couch, close enough to reach me if he stretched just a bit. But he didn't. He didn't have to. I felt him. Mark stood and headed toward the kitchen. "You guys want tea? I'm making some." "Sure," I said. Jake didn't answer. When Mark disappeared into the kitchen, Jake leaned over, barely a breath from my ear. "I need to talk to you," he whispered. I nodded. My hands were shaking. That night we met in the laundry room. The only room in the house with no cameras, no creaky floorboards, no eyes. "I think he suspects something Jake said." I shook my head. "No, he's just tired." Jake ran a hand through his damp hair. "We need to stop, really stop, or we'll get caught." I wanted to say yes, I wanted to agree, but the words wouldn't come. Because the truth was, I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to go back to cold silences and invisible dinners. I didn't want to erase the only thing in this house that felt real. Jake looked at me with something deeper than lust, something dangerously close to love. "If we don't end this soon," he said, "we'll destroy everything." And in that moment, I realized something that should have terrified me. I wasn't afraid of destroying everything. I was afraid of going back to nothing. Thanksgiving was always complicated in our house. Mark insisted on tradition turkey stuffing crystal glasses no one used the rest of the year. But it was more about appearance than gratitude. He liked the illusion of a perfect family. This year, that illusion felt heavier than ever. Jake had agreed to bring a date. A girl named Melissa from his community college days. She was sweet, polite, and just unaware enough to not sense the tension in the room. I hated her for how easy it was for her to smile. I hated myself for hating her. I wore my best dress, not for Mark, not even for Jake, but because I needed anything to feel beautiful again. Real, present. As we sat at the long, over-decorated table, I felt like an actress in a play I no longer understood. Jake sat across from me, his hand resting casually on Melissa's chair. He laughed at her jokes. He filled her wine glass. And every time he did, he looked at me. Not long, not directly, but enough. Enough to make me ache. Mark, for once, was animated, telling stories, pouring drinks, playing host like it was his calling. And me, I smiled. I served the pie. I asked Melissa about her job, her parents, her favorite movie. But beneath the pleasantries, my skin burned. After dinner, as the others dozed off on the couch or cleaned the kitchen, I stepped outside. The air was cold and sharp enough to sting, but not enough to make me go back in. Jake followed a few minutes later. He didn't say anything, just stood beside me in the dark, staring out into the barren yard. "She's not you," he finally said. I exhaled slowly. "That's the point, isn't it?" He turned toward me. "I didn't bring her for me. I brought her for him, for you, for this house." "I know." We stood there, not touching, not moving, barely breathing. I keep thinking I whispered if we had met in a different time, a different story. Maybe this would have been okay. He smiled bitterly, but we didn't, and it's not. A gust of wind pushed between us like a warning. I turned to go back inside. Jake didn't stop me, but before I reached the door, he called out softly, "I'm trying to forget that night." I paused and whispered back, "I'm trying not to." It happened during one of those casual moments, the kind you think is safe. Mark was out back cleaning the gutters. I was in the kitchen preparing a grocery list. Jake walked in behind me, barefoot, his hair damp from a shower. "Do you want anything from the store?" I asked without turning. He stepped closer, too close, and whispered near my ear, "Just you." I froze. It was a joke, a stupid, reckless joke. But I laughed quietly, too softly, and Mark walked in just in time to hear it. He didn't say anything right away, just stood there in the doorway with leaves in his hands and suspicion in his eyes. Jake straightened, clearing his throat. "Hey, Dad." Mark looked at him, then at me, then back again. "What's going on in here?" he asked, casual but cold. Jake shrugged. "Just asking about groceries." Mark narrowed his eyes, then muttered something about needing a ladder and walked off. But I knew. I knew he had seen something, maybe not proof, but a spark. A flicker of something wrong. Something unspoken. That night, Mark was quiet again. Too quiet. He ate dinner without looking at me. Didn't ask about my day, didn't say goodnight. The next morning, I found a receipt on the counter. A hotel booking, 2 nights, his name. He hadn't said a word about leaving. When I asked, he waved it off. Conference, last minute, no big deal. I nodded, pretending I believed him. But something in his eyes had changed. And for the first time since that stormy night, I realized something terrifying. This house wasn't just filled with secrets anymore. It was filled with people pretending not to know them. Later that night, Jake found me in the laundry room again. "Our old meeting place. I think he knows," I said. Jake nodded. "Yeah, I think so too." I leaned back against the washer, feeling its quiet hum beneath me. "What happens now?" Jake stepped forward, close, his voice low. "We stop. We really stop. Before this goes too far." "It's already gone too far," I whispered. He touched my face gently. "Then we have to choose." I looked up at him. "Choose what?" He hesitated. Whether to burn it down or walk away. We stood there in silence, the weight of everything pressing down like a slow, crushing wave. Neither of us moved. Because the truth was, we didn't know how to do either. Mark's silence was no longer passive. It was sharp, deliberate. He stopped asking questions, stopped offering excuses for his absences. He came and went like a stranger who'd once lived here, not like a husband. The air in the house changed, thicker, heavier, as if we were all holding our breath, and no one knew how to exhale. Jake noticed too. He avoided meals, avoided eye contact. But even in avoidance, there was something between us, something alive pulsing beneath the surface, refusing to die. I tried to behave as if everything were normal. Laundry, groceries, bills. I smiled when necessary. I cooked when expected. But I wasn't in the house anymore. I was drifting through it like a ghost, still haunted by its own desires. One evening, while folding clothes in the bedroom, I found a letter in Mark's nightstand drawer. It wasn't addressed, it wasn't signed, but it was short, and it was enough. "I know something's going on. Maybe it's not physical, maybe it is, but I'm not stupid. If you think I don't see it, you're wrong. Whatever this is, end it, or I will." My hands trembled. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't a plea, it was a line in the sand. I folded the letter back neatly and placed it where I found it. He had meant for me to find it. He wanted me to know, and he wanted me to fear the next step. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed beside him, motionless, while he snored softly beside me, content in his quiet warfare. He didn't have to scream. He didn't need evidence. He had silence. And silence can be the most dangerous form of power. The next morning, Jake didn't come down for breakfast. At noon, I found him sitting on the edge of the back porch, staring out at the dying autumn leaves. "He knows," I said softly, joining him. Jake didn't flinch, I figured. He left me a note, in his drawer, told me to stop, or he would. Jake rubbed his temples. "What does that mean, he would?" "I don't know," I said. "But I don't want to find out." We sat in silence again. A different kind of silence this time. Not the one that seduces, the one that mourns. Jake looked at me, his eyes tired. "So, what do we do?" I didn't answer, because for the first time since that stormy night, I didn't know. Mark didn't leave the house that weekend. He hovered. He lingered in doorways, stood in silence during conversations, appeared in rooms with no explanation. He never yelled, never confronted. But his presence was like smoke in the walls, constant suffocating. Jake started spending more time at work and at the gym. He'd leave early, come home late. I couldn't tell if he was avoiding Mark or me or both. On Sunday afternoon, Mark asked me to sit with him on the patio. It was rare. He usually avoided anything resembling intimacy, especially without a television or distraction involved. I followed him out heart-hammering, like I was about to take a test I hadn't studied for. He poured 2 glasses of wine and handed me one. You know, he began staring out at the trees. I never thought I'd be the type of man whose wife might drift. I said nothing. "But I guess that's how it happens, right?" he continued. "You stop showing up. You get comfortable. You forget to look at her like she's still someone worth seeing." I looked down at my glass. "Mark." He held up a hand. "I'm not asking for an apology. I'm not even asking for the truth. I just want to say this: I know more than you think. And I've chosen to look away. So far." That last part hit like a blade. "So far," I repeated. "I have limits," he said simply. "I'm not a fool, and I'm not weak." Then he stood, walked back inside, and left me sitting there stunned. That night, I stared at the ceiling again like I had so many nights before. But the weight wasn't from guilt anymore. It was fear. Mark wasn't going to blow up. He wasn't going to scream or demand. He was going to wait. And when the moment was right, he would end this his way. Jake came to my door at 1:30 a.m. I opened it, not surprised. "We need to stop," I said before he could speak. "I know," he whispered. He stepped inside anyway. He didn't touch me. He didn't try to. He just sat at the edge of the bed and looked at me with the kind of ache that doesn't need words. "I'm not strong enough to walk away," he said. "I'm not either," I admitted. "So, what do we do?" he asked. I exhaled, steady and hollow. "We stop pretending this doesn't cost us something." And we sat there, 2 people buried under the ashes of a house still standing, trying to decide if we were brave enough to let it burn completely, or cowardly enough to watch it smolder forever. It was a Wednesday when the cracks finally split open. I had just come back from the grocery store when I saw Mark's car parked at the curb, odd since he was supposed to be out of town for 2 days. The front door was unlocked. I stepped inside expecting silence. Instead, I heard voices. Mark's, Jake's, low, clipped, heated. I dropped the grocery bag, forgetting the eggs. They shattered on the floor behind me as I followed the sound to the back of the house. They were in the garage. The door was cracked open, and I paused just long enough to hear the tone shift. "You think I don't see it?" Mark hissed. "You walk around this house like I'm already gone." Jake didn't respond right away. "I've seen the looks," Mark went on, heard the footsteps. "I'm not an idiot." "You don't have proof," Jake said, voice low. "You're right," Mark replied. "I don't. But I don't need it anymore. I just needed to hear you not deny it." There was a beat of silence so loud it nearly swallowed me whole. Jake finally said, "What are you going to do?" Mark laughed, but it was bitter joyless. "I haven't decided yet." I stepped away from the door before they could see me, heart pounding, skin cold, mouth dry. I ran to the bathroom, locked the door, and leaned against it like it could somehow hold back the chaos about to spill through every crack in my life. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. This is who I was now. The wife who kissed her stepson. The woman who watched her marriage rot and fed the decay with secrets. The fool who thought nothing would catch fire if she just kept lighting matches. That evening, the house was silent again. Mark didn't come to bed. Jake didn't text. I lay there alone in a room that no longer felt like mine, wondering when the final piece would fall. And then at 2:07 a.m., I got the message. From Mark. 1 sentence. "You should start packing." I read it 5 times each word, digging deeper than the last. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a threat. It was the end. I didn't cry. Not when I packed my things. Not when I zipped the suitcase and carried it down the stairs in the middle of the night. Not when I passed the living room where Mark sat silently in the dark, watching but saying nothing. His silence was colder than shouting ever could be. Jake wasn't home. Maybe that was for the best. I didn't know how I would have looked at him, what I would have said. A part of me hoped he would come barreling in, grab my suitcase, beg me to stay. Another part feared exactly that. I placed the keys on the hallway table, the ones I'd once been so proud to hold. The house was still, too still, as if it had already moved on without me. I walked outside. The air was cold, biting, but clean. A strange relief after so many weeks of suffocating heat inside those walls. As I reached my car, I heard footsteps. I turned. Jake? His hair was tousled, his eyes wide with panic. "Where are you going?" I swallowed. He told me to leave. Jake looked over my shoulder at the front door. He finally said it. I nodded. He stepped closer. "Then I'm going with you." My breath caught. "Jake, no." "Yes," he said. "If you're leaving, I'm leaving. I'm done pretending. I don't care what it looks like anymore." I placed a hand on his chest. "You think that sounds noble. But it's not love. It's damage. You don't get to run from one broken home into another." "I'm not running," he insisted. "You are," I said softly, "and I won't let you run to me." He looked at me, hurt deep in his eyes. "So this is it." I reached up and touched his face one last time. "It has to be." He closed his eyes as my fingers lingered near his jaw. "You were never supposed to be mine," I whispered. "And I was never meant to need you like I did." The wind rustled around us, carrying the final thread of something that had once felt inevitable. I kissed him softly one last time on the cheek. Then I got in the car. I didn't look back as I drove away, but I felt him watching. And in that moment, I knew goodbye would never be enough. Because some lines once crossed don't ever fade. They stay burned beneath the skin. It's been 6 months since I left. I live in a small apartment now, 1-bedroom, creaky floors, and windows that rattle when it rains. It's not much, but it's mine. I make my own coffee in the mornings, fold my own laundry, eat dinner at a table meant for one. Silence has become a companion I've had to learn to love again. Mark never reached out, not once. I heard through a mutual friend that he filed for divorce 2 weeks after I left. No dramatic scenes, no court battles. Just papers and signatures and a polite line drawn between 2 lives that had long since stopped intersecting. "Jake?" He texted me on Christmas. "I hope you're okay." I didn't reply. He messaged again on my birthday. "I miss you." I didn't reply then either. Because what would I say? That I miss him too. That I replay that stormy night more often than I should. That I still sleep on the left side of the bed because the right side never quite feels like mine. There are no instructions for grieving something you're not allowed to mourn. No script for ending a relationship you're not supposed to admit ever existed. Some days I convince myself it was just loneliness. Other days I know better. I know it was love. Twisted, flawed, impossible, but real. The hardest part isn't the guilt. It's the memory of feeling seen, of feeling alive. I still have that photo of him, Jake, from that first Christmas buried in a drawer. I haven't looked at it in weeks, but I know it's there, just like he is. Still, some stories don't get endings. They just stop, abrupt, uneasy, half-finished. This was mine, and maybe that's the truest kind of confession I can offer. That I loved someone I shouldn't have. That I lost everything because of it. And that sometimes quietly, painfully, I'd do it all again. Because not all fires destroy. Some just leave you warm enough to remember what it meant to feel.